Coming up in this video, I'll show you how I paint the greatest Space Marine chapter of all time, the Ultramarines. Welcome back to MiniJunkie, everyone. My name is Jarrett. So if I triggered anyone with that initial statement about the Ultramarines, I'm just kidding. Everyone knows the Imperial Fists were the greatest chapter of all time. So I decided, it would be great to paint the newest Space Marine special release kind of thing, the Primaris Lieutenant, which was the one of the 500th store exclusives that came out recently from Games Workshop. I don't know, I just think it's a really cool model. I love the way he's kind of carrying half of his helmet. Great pose, great face to paint, or half of one. And I actually thought at first, hey, wow, this is like the first Space Marine I'm painting for this channel, which is odd. But then I realized I've painted a Death Watch kill team, so it's not really. I'm doing Ultramarines for a couple reasons. One is it's kind of the de facto Space Marine chapter that people starting out painting are probably going to do. Okay, two is it's interesting to see how different painters come at painting Ultramarines, because there's actually a surprisingly large number of ways you can do them. But one of the main reasons is I actually have a pretty large Ultramarine army painted, and I'll put a little video I quickly shot of that up here. And the interesting thing about this army is I painted only half, maybe even only a third of it. It's actually mostly painted by Gareth Etherington, Garfy, on Tale of Painters, and it's actually been shown in White Dwarf, for example. And I bought it off him at a time where I decided that I wanted to see how, what it's like to buy painted miniatures from someone else and receive them, and kind of see this feeling of seeing a painted miniature by someone else in the flesh for the first time. I know it sounds completely ridiculous, but anyway, I bought it. I thought it was really cool. I'm really happy with it, and then I started to add to it. So I've added a couple vehicles, a lot of most of the Primaris in the army were painted by me, and this Primaris Lieutenant that we're going to paint today is done by me, obviously. This video is also special because I'm releasing it at a time when I hit a milestone I set for myself when I resurrected the channel back in late February, March of this year. And that milestone is 4,450 subscribers, give or take. And the reason I came up with that number and not 5,000 is I just did some back of the napkin kind of math and figured by the end of this year I wanted to hit that number of subscribers, and we've managed to hit that number with still just over a month to go in the year, which is great, and I thank all of you for helping me achieve that goal. But blah blah blah, these intros are too long, I realize. One last point, I'm doing another giveaway. I'm giving away the model we're painting today, a new copy of the model. I'm going to keep the painted one, the 500th store, I can never say this, Primaris Lieutenant. I'll be giving that away in the same fashion that I gave away the Night Haunt one recently, where I'm going to ask you to comment below, list the way that I can reach you, whether that's Twitter, Instagram, whatever, and maybe say something about the channel in terms of what kind of content you like best that I'm putting out, whether it's tutorials, commentary, unboxings, whatever. Just a little bit more than just posting your contact info, which is not quite as interesting for me or the other readers. But in terms of the giveaway, you do not have to be a subscriber. There's no cost of entry. You don't have to buy anything. Consider the terms and conditions being simply comment below, and I will randomly select a comment using a random comment selector software thing. If you're interested in painting miniatures and you want to learn more about it and just follow along with all the different techniques I'm sharing, consider subscribing and clicking the bell notification so you're notified whenever I post a new video. On one last note, I will point out that my painting has slowed down in the last few weeks, and my video editing has slowed down. The black dog is barking really loud, and I learned that black dog thing recently from the Terrain Tutor, one of his videos. I'd never heard that expression before, so if you're curious what that means, go ahead and Google it. But yeah, noisy black dog, and I'm trying to quiet it down and move on. But yeah, it's put a damper on my painting and my video editing, but I'm going to keep on trucking. And on that note, here's a look at the finished miniature we're painting today. This is the Space Marine Primaris Lieutenant. There are lots of colored primers out there, but for me, I start with a black primer. Make sure you get a nice solid coat. You can use any brand you like. From there, I'm giving it an all-over coat of Vallejo Game Air Ultramarine Blue. I use an airbrush, and I don't worry about getting it on things that aren't the armor. You can also hand brush this on. Next, I prepare a wash that's using Army Painter Blue Tone and Dark Tone, and you can see in the video how many drops of each I'm using. You can feel free to modify that. Maybe you want a little more black in it, which would be more dark tone. And then I just mix that up, and I'm not thinning it or diluting it. Mix that up and just apply it all over the blue armored areas with a wash or shade brush of your choice. As with all washes, you want to watch for any heavy pooling that happens and just soak that up with the brush and make sure that it's evenly distributed. Now when that's done, you're going to have a fairly dark and somewhat blotchy in areas finished effect. You want to make sure you've allowed that to dry. And then I come back in with the Vallejo Air Ultramarine and I airbrush it very carefully onto various panels to kind of clean up that blotchy look, especially on the shoulder pads, backs of legs, sides of legs, tops of the jetpack, things like that. Then rather than jump to a completely different color, to highlight I add a bit of Vallejo Game Air Wolf Gray to the original Ultramarine color, and I'm not precise. I just blob a drop or two into my cup, mix it up and airbrush it onto the areas that I just previously, you're basically highlighting, right? The tops of the shoulder pads, the upper raised portions of whether it be the jetpack, the knee pads, things like that. This process will most likely paint over some of the areas where we've got the dark lining from the wash, and we'll come back and fix that later. But here you can see again, I'm just adding a couple more drops of Wolf Gray and doing an even lighter airbrush highlight. You can hand brush these highlights. You would be mixing on a wet palette, and you'd be using probably some glazed medium just to help feather and blend in your highlights as opposed to having really thick layering. However, the airbrush is how I get a smoother transition for sure, and you should not be afraid to dive into airbrushing. I'll just make that quick pitch and then move on. Now we'll just restore some of the dark lining we had from that original wash. You just go back to your original mix, or mix some more up if you need to, and just taking a fine detail brush, just run it along the the edges of the shoulder pad trim or anywhere that the airbrushed highlighting or your painted highlighting has sort of obscured the original dark lining effect that we had. Take your time. This wash will wipe off very easily with your finger if you make a mistake, but it should be pretty easy. There's quite a few options when it comes to the edge highlighting here. I'm using Blue Horror Edge Highlight Paint from GW. You could use a Space Wolf Gray, a Fenrisian Gray. Any very, very light bluish gray is going to work fine here. It's almost indistinguishable at a certain point. So, in fact, I'm sure I've actually highlighted with a different color in the past. Edge highlighting can be tricky. Just take your time, use the side of the brush or the side of the tip of the brush, and try to keep it neat. That's important. Now I paint all of the ribbed looking areas. I don't know if that's meant to be rubber or whatever, between knee joints, elbow joints, etc. I use this metallic air Vallejo silver because it flows really easily into those areas. You can use any silver you want, however. The trim depends on your Ultramarine company, but mine came with a green trim on the shoulder pads, so that's what I'm matching. I start that out with a base coat of Lauren Forest, but again, you may have gold trim, you may have a different color trim, so you paint that how you like. I highlight that with Vallejo Air Goblin Green. This is another one where I'm actually pretty imprecise with the colors I'm using, and sometimes I think I actually use different ones as long as I'm getting roughly the same green look. Here's what I mean about painting holsters and things. It's very elementary. I'm using P3 Gun Core Brown. I actually think in hindsight maybe I should have used a Doom Bull Brown. Something more of a reddish brown would have looked nicer in this case. Now I just shade the ribbed areas in the joints with a Nuln Oil. Very simple. The only real thing to watch for here is try not to get it on the surrounding armor, and even if you do, you should be able to wipe it off if you move quickly. The eagle on the chest and on the leg is painted gold. I use Retributor Armor as the base, but you can use your preferred gold. Gold is generally gold. I'm not super thrilled with how I attacked the weapon overall. You'll kind of see why, I think. Anyway, I start out with gunmetal, Vallejo Premium Air gunmetal. It flows nicely. It gives a nice gunmetal effect, and I just painted over the metallic areas of the gun, and I actually painted onto some areas that are going to be black in the long run. which is to say that was an accident. I also used this color on the hand scanner thing that's strapped to his belt in the back. And you can paint any other bits and bobs you want to see as metallic in this way. You want the little rope on his shoulder to be red. I came at it to sort of achieve an orangey red, starting out with a base coat of Scorn Red from P3. Now I highlight anything that I painted with the gunmetal or lead belcher if you used it. I'm using chainmail, which is essentially like a Runefang steel, and I just highlight all the metallic areas. I pretty much painted over the vast majority of the gunmetal color. I eventually also used that on little, tubes around his face or little knobs on his head. This is the color I used for those. Hey guys, hope you're enjoying the video. One last thing, I wanted to point out that more and more with these guides and tutorials, I'm going to not go into a lot of detail on how I'm painting things like boots, sheaths for weapons, pistol holsters, bags, and the things that are really simple. That are just like, paint it brown, wash it with Agrax, and give it a highlight. Those things become very repetitive in the tutorials and are so basic that they're kind of not worth pointing out, and they're covered in countless other videos. Hopefully you don't hear my dryer beeping. But I will go into the things that make that particular paint job special or unique to me or unique to the techniques and methods that I'm showing you. So actually comment below if you're okay with that, or if you think that's going to be a problem for you going forward, if you want to see how I'm achieving a certain leather brown on a certain satchel. To bring out the definition in the rope, I just gave it a wash of sepia ink. Sepia ink makes an appearance in just about every tutorial I do, so you might as well go grab a pot of that at some point. I washed the gold with a custom mix of Agrax Earthshade Gloss and Reichland Flesh Shade Gloss that I keep in that bottle you just saw. There's a bullet casing hanging from his shoulder pad and some tiny little brass bits showing in the ammo clip magazine thing. I use Victorian brass from P3. You can use any brass color you like. The flesh is interesting. You could easily just start with a base coat of Bugman Glow. I decided I wanted to use my Scale 75 flesh paints a bit, and so I started out with pink flesh, and this definitely didn't cover amazingly well over the blue that had gotten on the face area, so 2 thin coats was required. I painted the weapon casing or housing in Thamar Black. This is something where you can use any black you like. Highlighted the rope with a new color from P3 called Inferno Orange. It's this really beautiful bright orange. I'll have to see if there's other uses for it I can find on future miniatures. To highlight the rope, I just take a bit of that orange and just dot it along the top of each coil of the rope. Apparently I thought this was worth a lot of footage. I gave the face, after those 2 thin coats had dried and I had a nice solid surface for his the base coat of the flesh, I gave that a wash with Reichland Flesh Shade right out of the bottle. Or as a more sophisticated way of saying it would be neat. Best part of the video, I highlight the black casing of the weapon with Eshin Gray, just lining the edges of that casing. And you can use any gray you want. It's just... this part is just so boring. Then I just washed the whole weapon with Nuln Oil Gloss. Like I said, I'm not happy with how I attacked this weapon, and I mean in the end it ends up looking okay. In your case, you don't have to apply this all over the weapon, you could just do it on the metal parts. I went for brown hair, starting with a base of Rhinox hide, just carefully covering all the hair areas. This guy's tricky. He's got kind of like a half mohawk thing going on, and his head is shaved where some of the dots and pipes are, so you have to look really carefully. I actually gave him too much hair at first, and I had to fix that later. First step of highlighting the face was to use that pink flesh from Scale 75 as an initial highlight over once the Reichland Flesh Shade had dried. In a recent video, someone said usually they paint the eyes first and then highlight so they can fix any mistakes, which makes absolutely perfect sense. So in my case, I did the eyes now using the usual color I use, which is P3 Menoth White Highlight for the eyeball. And you can wait for me to do the pupil later, because I came back to highlight the face using a mix of pink flesh and basic flesh, about 50-50. And in each case, when you highlight the skin, you're trying to cover a little bit less area than the last highlight, and you're doing, like I said, raised areas, upper forehead, top of head, eyebrows, and if he had a nose, you would be doing the bridge of his nose. I mean, he probably has a nose, but he's wearing the mask, so we're not going to be painting the nose. This is also a good time to fix that unbelievably finicky little spot where the tops of his cheekbones are showing behind the mask. It's like really not easy to get that painted in, but you kind of need it because you don't want his eyeballs just bleeding right into the mask, because that wouldn't look right, because then it's like he's peeking over the mask. Then I decided I wanted to jump to an even lighter color for the flesh, so I added a drop of white. I use premium white primer for no particular reason. Any white will do. I am using a wet palette, but refuse to show you. There's no science to this. I don't I don't use a pipette to add just a perfect amount. I just add a drop. I mix it in. I make sure the shade looks not outrageously too bright, and I paint in my highlight. And I'm going to be doing this for a couple steps. When it comes to a nice character figure, the more steps you do highlighting the flesh, and I mean you can go all the way up to pure white sometimes, the more impactful and nice that figure is going to look. And in particular, the face is generally the focal point of the miniature, where the person's eyes are going to go first, so you want to spend the most time on the face almost always. Continuing to highlight because I'm spending a lot of time in the face, and I'm showing you a lot of footage of me painting the face in case that's interesting, in case you want to see how faces are highlighted. Again, I added one more drop to the existing mix that's on the wet palette, again covering less and less of the area. I'm basically filling in dead air right now with my voice, because there's a lot of footage of painting this face that I just feel like it's weird if it's just music, but maybe that's okay. Now I go back with some of the original ultramarine color, and I fix up any little mistakes I've made, and there you see I'm once again trying to fix the darn area where the mask is meeting the head. That part was tricky. But anywhere you see mistakes, maybe your edge highlighting got messy, sometimes the difference between a good miniature and a great miniature is the fact that you've gone back and just fixed the little mistakes that you can see, and therefore everyone else will also see. Don't be afraid to go back and correct things that maybe don't look right to you. Where the Rhinox hide was an all-over base coat of the hair, with Steel Legion drab, I'm coming in and I'm trying to create texture and suggest that his hair has texture, and I'm doing so by painting thin lines and streaks, and not trying to be perfect with it, but not trying to cover all of the area so that it does retain some texture. I did mention this previously, but I do use chainmail or runefang steel to paint the knobbies and the pipes that are on the side of his head. I actually had a lot of trouble figuring out which part was hair and which part was not, and then that's when I realized that he has that funky haircut where the side of his head is essentially shaved, and I did come back later and fix that with some flesh color. In fact, I was having so much trouble with that area, I posted this photo on a Facebook group and asked people what the heck is supposed to be skin and what's not, and that's how I got the help I needed to figure out the details and paint it properly. Don't be afraid to do that. If you need help, post a photo on a group and ask for tips or insights. Now it was time to paint that red and white stripe on his helmet, which was never going to be easy, and I was worried about it. I start out with a base of Celestra Gray, which I find covers a little nicer than Ulthuan Gray, even though Ulthuan is kind of the go-to for most people when it comes to painting white. They'll undercoat with Ulthuan Gray first. In my case, I used Celestra, and it worked out pretty well. Once it had dried, I covered it up completely with white. I used P3 Morrow White. It's a very nice, bright, crisp white, and in this case I thought it would be great for this white stripe that I'm over-explaining. I continue to obsess about his head knobs and pipes, and I went in with Reichland Flesh Shade just to try and create a little bit more definition and separation between them and the skin of his head. I highlighted the eagle with Scale 75 Elf Gold. You can use any brighter gold than what you originally base coated with to do this, and you're just going to highlight each individual feather just towards the tip of the feather, which is super easy, I bet, for all of us. When it came time to paint the red on the stripe of the helmet, I totally wasn't worried about wrecking that really nice white stripe I'd achieved. I used Mephistone Red, and I used the white outer edge as a guideline for keeping it even, so I tried to make sure that the same amount of white was showing all the way down the helmet, and that's how I did both sides of this red strip. So just take your time, mark it out for yourself, and just slowly paint it on, and try not to shake. And that's how I paint Ultramarines and how I painted this Ultramarine. I'm not going into some of the more detailed things. I don't think it's needed. If you have a question, though, about anything, shoot it below and I'll definitely answer you. The basing is done to match the basing of the original army. It is somewhat simple. I don't mind. I think it looks pretty cool. If you need to know how that's done, you can also post below. But hopefully you like how this turned out. Don't forget to enter the contest below for the giveaway of this miniature, not the painted one. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. Watch out for future videos. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. We'll see you next time.